Every nation has stories that get told so often they become legend. But then there are the other stories, the ones that get buried, sometimes literally. For 80 years, in a Dublin prison yard, 10 coffins lay hidden in the earth. These weren't the graves of criminals, they belonged to men considered by many to be heroes, executed for their dream of a free Ireland. Their enemies buried their bodies, and for a long, long time, history tried to bury their story. This is the incredible true story of the decades long secret battle to find Ireland's forgotten 10 and a conspiracy of silence that tried to erase them from history for good. The years 1920 and 1921 were some of the most violent in Ireland's history. The Irish War of Independence was raging, a brutal guerrilla conflict between IRA volunteers and British Crown forces fought in city streets and quiet country lanes. Dublin became a city of shadows, curfews, and constant fear. At the centre of it all stood Mountjoy Prison, an imposing Victorian fortress that would become the final stop for many who dared to fight the Empire. During the war, British authorities executed 24 men across Ireland. In the southern counties, where martial law was in full effect, men were shot by firing squad. But in Dublin, the punishment was different. Here, in the civilian prison of Mountjoy, 10 men were sentenced to death by hanging. Now, this wasn't just a procedural detail, it was a calculated message. Being shot was seen as a soldier's death. Being hanged was for common criminals. The British were making it clear, in their eyes, these men weren't soldiers of a new republic, but traitors and murderers. The hangings started in the bleak winter of 1920 and continued into the summer of 1921. They eventually became known as the Forgotten Ten, but that name is a little misleading. They were never forgotten by the people who loved them or by those who shared their cause. They were hidden. The group was made up of ordinary men in extraordinary times: students, a carpenter, an electrician, a grocer's assistant. Their ages ranged from just 18 to 40. Some were husbands and fathers, others were young men whose lives were just beginning. The most famous of them was Kevin Barry. He was an 18-year-old medical student captured after an ambush in Dublin that left three young British soldiers dead. His youth, combined with reports that he was tortured in custody to give up the names of his comrades, which he refused to do, turned his case into an international scandal. His execution on November 1st, 1920, sent a shockwave across Ireland and the world. Then there were men like Patrick Moran and Thomas Whelan. Both were arrested after Bloody Sunday in November 1920, when the IRA assassinated a group of British intelligence agents. Both men insisted they were innocent. In fact, Moran was so confident his alibi would clear him that he actually refused an opportunity to escape from another jail. It didn't work. On March 14, 1921, Moran and Whelan were hanged, along with 4 others: Frank Flood, Bernard Ryan, Thomas Bryan, and Patrick Doyle. Later, Thomas Traynor, a father of 10, and finally, Patrick Maher and Edmund Foley would meet the same fate. Each man left behind heartbreaking last letters filled with love for their families and their country. But why do this? Why go to such lengths, not just to end their lives, but to hide their graves? It was a cold, deliberate act of political strategy. Under military law at the time, British authorities had the right to deny a formal burial. The bodies of the executed men were considered their property, and they chose to bury them in unmarked graves, in unconsecrated ground, right inside the prison yard. There were a few key reasons for this. First, they wanted to deny them martyrdom. The British had learned a hard lesson from the executions of the 1916 Easter Rising leaders. Those executions had turned public opinion against them and transformed the rebels into national saints, with massive funerals becoming a powerful show of Republican defiance. By burying the forgotten 10 in secret, they hoped to stop their graves from becoming shrines and their funerals from becoming rallies. Second, it was a form of psychological warfare. For the families, this created a unique and devastating kind of grief. There was no grave to visit, no headstone to place flowers on, and no final goodbye. Their loved ones just vanished into the state's prison system. It was a final, cruel assertion of power. Just before his own execution, the rebel Thomas Bryan wrote to his father-in-law, worrying about his pregnant wife and saying, "It's our women who suffer the most." This policy made sure that suffering would continue long after the hangings were over. And finally, it was a blunt attempt to write them out of history by denying them a place in Ireland's national cemeteries alongside other patriot dead. The authorities were making a statement. These men don't belong to this nation's story. They are to be forgotten. After the War of Independence ended and the Irish Free State was formed, control of Mountjoy prison passed into Irish hands. And yet, the men stayed right where they were, in their prison graves. As early as the 1920s, families began pleading for the government to return their loved ones' remains. They were soon joined by a dedicated group called the National Graves Association, an organisation formed to look after the graves of Ireland's patriot dead. For decades, this small group campaigned tirelessly, writing letters, lobbying politicians, and doing everything they could to keep the men's memory alive. It was a slow, frustrating battle against political apathy. The graves were eventually identified inside the prison grounds in 1934, but still nothing was done. An entire generation was born and grew old while the 10 men lay in the prison yard. It started to seem like the British strategy had actually worked. To the wider public, the men had faded into a historical footnote, their story overshadowed by the Irish Civil War and the difficult work of building a new state. The name, the Forgotten Ten, wasn't about being forgotten by their families, but by the very nation they had died for. The campaign dragged on for 80 years, but the flame of remembrance kept alive by the National Graves Association and the men's descendants never truly went out. By the 1990s, with the Northern Ireland peace process underway and a new sense of historical reflection in the air, the political will finally began to shift. A Celtic cross was put up for the men in Glasnevin Cemetery in 1996, a symbolic promise of a final resting place to come. Then, on November 2000, the 80th anniversary of Kevin Barry's execution, the Irish government announced that the bodies would be exhumed. The search began. Archaeologists and forensic experts carefully started to excavate a patch of ground in the prison yard. It was a somber, painstaking process, a modern search for a historical injustice. And then they found them, the remains of 10 men, buried exactly where old records and the campaigners' memories said they would be. After 8 decades in the dark, the secret of the prison yard was finally brought into the light. On October 14, 2001, Ireland stopped to watch. The nation that had once been forced to forget its heroes now gave them one of its highest honours, a full state funeral. It was only the 13th state funeral since Ireland had gained its independence. The day began with a private service in Mountjoy prison, where family members, many of them grandnieces and grandnephews, finally stood by the coffins of their ancestors. Draped in the Irish tricolour, 10 hearses began a slow procession through the streets of Dublin. The very bell that had once tolled for their executions now tolled in their honour. Tens of thousands of people lined the streets, breaking into spontaneous applause as the cortege passed. The procession paused at the GPO on O'Connell Street, the heart of the 1916 Rising, before continuing to St. Mary's Pro-Cathedral for a Requiem Mass. Finally, the men were brought to Glasnevin Cemetery, the resting place of Ireland's most revered national figures. 9 of the men were reinterred together in a special plot. The 10th, Patrick Maher, was buried in his native County Limerick at his family's request. As the final honours were given, it was clear this was more than just a burial. It was a moment of national importance, the closing of a painful chapter left open for far too long. A wrong had finally been righted. The story of the Forgotten 10 is a powerful lesson in how history is not just a set of facts, but a battle of memory. For 80 years, these men were punished in a way that went beyond their debts, an attempt to erase their sacrifice from the national story. But the state that buried them as criminals is gone, and the nation they fought for is now a reality. The decades-long struggle to reclaim their bodies was a fight against forgetting, a quiet but firm insistence that justice doesn't have an expiration date. The state funeral in 2001 wasn't about glorifying violence, but about acknowledging the complex, painful, and human cost of independence. It was a declaration that a mature nation has to have the courage to look into its own unmarked graves, uncover the difficult truths buried there, and finally bring its heroes home. If you found the story of hidden history as compelling as we did, please If you found this story of hidden history as compelling as we did, please subscribe and hit that notification bell for more untold stories from the past. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. What other forgotten figures from history deserve to have their stories told? Thank you for joining us on Emerald Chronicle.
Ireland's story isn't written in straight lines. It moves like mist over the Wicklow Hills, shifting, echoing, alive. This is Emerald Chronicle history, myths, legends, and folk tales of Ireland. Here, the past isn't just remembered, it's felt. It hums beneath the soil, whispers through stone, and dances in the rhythm of old songs. We follow that hum, from the first footfalls of prehistory to the last echoes of rebellion. We trace Ireland's winding tale. This is where druids walk beside rebels, where saints whisper to poets, where the sacred and the silenced share the same breath. We don't just tell stories, we reawaken them. Each video is a journey, immersive, evocative, and grounded in truth. Our team dives deep into manuscripts, records, and oral traditions, unearthing fragments of memory long buried. We use AI not to rewrite the past, but to give it form, painting what memory alone cannot. But it's the human voice, the human care, that drives everything we do. You'll find playlists crafted like chapters in a living book, stories of forgotten voices, quiet uprisings, spiritual reckonings, lost kingdoms, distant echoes, and the ever-burning flame of resistance. We explore the mystical and the political, the poetic and the painful, because Ireland's past was never just history. It was always poetry, wrapped in silence, waiting to be heard. Emerald Chronicle is for the curious, the seekers, the lovers of lore. It's for those who feel the pull of something ancient in the wind, for those who believe that myth and memory are two sides of the same truth. So whether you're drawn to the legends of the Tuatha De Danann, the ghostly echoes of famine roads, or the whispered prayers of monastic scribes, there's a place for you here. This is not just a channel, it's a portal, a gathering of stories, a chorus of voices, long thought lost.
Keep your eyes peeled! Nothing on this side.
And now, you're here. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Emerald Chronicle. And leave a comment. We reply to every single one within 24 hours or less. Welcome to the Chronicle. Let the story begin.